Dear conference participants, welcome back from lunch. Dear viewers following us now on camera, welcome to Gothenburg. This double event, this is the second keynote of the 2024 International Schumpeter Society Scientific Conference. It is also, at the same time, the 2024 Swedish Schumpeter Lecturer. This is a lecture series started in 2011, where we, at the Swedish Entrepreneurship Forum, that I represent here also together with the University of Gothenburg, where we bring leading thought leaders on Schumpeterian thought to Sweden once a year, when the conference does not happen to be in Sweden, to share insights about current trends in the world from a Schumpeterian perspective. So we're very happy to have this opportunity to make these two events happen at the same time here today. The 2024 speaker is Professor Javier Miranda from the Friedrich Schiller University in Jena and the Halle Institute for Economic Research. So he follows then in a tradition talking about the lecture series after speakers Maria Menitti, Stan Metcalf, and Ed Glaser, who gave the last 3 years Schumpeter lectures. If you're interested in some of those series, they're all, of course, filmed and online. Also, for those who are here in person today, you also can pick up the Stan Metcalf 2022 lecture in booklet format just at the doorway. We are going to have today's speaker up in just a moment. He has spent 20 years in the service of the US government to studying important phenomena around entrepreneurship and industrial dynamics. His research on business dynamics, entrepreneurship innovation, and high growth research has advanced the state of the art in measuring these phenomena and championing these core Schumpeterian themes in a broad economic literature. So we will have Javier giving the lecture. We will then have a short, small panel invited to comment on the lecture, and also, of course, we will have time for you in the audience who are here physically today to also give your questions and comments to Javier and to the panel. So please keep those in mind during the lecture. And with that, help me welcome Javier Miranda up on stage.
Thank you, Anders, very much. Thank you, everybody. I am delighted to be here. Anders, thank you so much, and thank you to the center and Maureen, Madam President, for a little bit longer. Amazing job with the conference. So thank you very much. Thank you both for having me here. So I am completely honored to be here with you and to be part of the Schumpeter Lecture. Thank you, Anders, for mentioning the previous presenters or participants in this lecture. I'm a little bit more nervous now. These are big shoes to fill. So again, I am delighted and I am truly honored to be part of the Schumpeter Lecture. Somebody asked me over lunch how do I feel about giving the talk on the Schumpeter Lecture, and I told her, well, I'll ask you after I give the talk, and then we'll see how I feel. So it's just great to be here. Great to see friends from the US. I don't know where you are, but I saw you earlier, and it's great to be part of this group now here in Europe. So I moved here about 3 years ago from the US. I'm European by origin and American by choice. I have dual citizen, and so and I really wanted to be back here in Europe, and I'm delighted to be with you. So let me grab my clicker and tell you a little bit about the promise and peril of entrepreneurship. And I very much feel like I'm preaching to the audience, right? So this group has been inspiring me for many, many years, and the research that we do at the Census Bureau, when I was part of the Census Bureau in the US. And so I was asked to talk about the promise and peril of entrepreneurship. Anders is exactly right. Big part of my research and my professional career has been built around data infrastructure, and identifying key facts about entrepreneurship, innovation. And so I want to tell you a little bit about that. So I'm going to tell you a story. I like how Maureen started her talk. I also like stories, so I'm gonna try to tell you a story. I'm gonna be drawing from research that is co-authored with many people. I won't mention them all. I'm also going to be drawing on research that is not my own. It's always going to be sourced, so you can see what it is that I'm talking about. So when I think about the promise and peril of entrepreneurship, I think about all of the progress that we've made over the last 15, 20 years. And that progress, in my case, has been very much data-driven. Right? So we've brought huge amounts of data, data that is comprehensive about the firms, the establishments that they open, the entrepreneurs that open up these ventures, that engage with business, as well as the workers and the inventors that propel these businesses forward. Right? So these comprehensive databases, in my case, we've been working on data infrastructure around administrative data, have really uncovered a set of facts that have challenged, in many ways, other disciplines within economics. So think about macroeconomics and I/O and labor and finance. So these facts that are being unveiled by data are really pushing things and receive knowledge from these other fields. At the same time, it's generating huge amounts of excitement. And it's drawing lots of talent into the entrepreneurship research world. Right? At the same time, new questions are being raised by the type of data and facts that we're disclosing. And so this is generating new questions, the need for new data. And so we continue to bring data and expand the data that we have to answer key questions about how the economy works. Okay, so very exciting. Lots of people, lots of energy in this field. And again, new questions are arising. A little bit of caution, or a little bit of a word of caution. So I've worked throughout my career with highly confidential data. And of course, data privacy and data protection is key when working with these types of data sets. We know how to work with these types of data sets. But clearly there needs to be a balance between data access and also data privacy and confidentiality. I'm going to make a few more remarks about that as we go along. So when I came out or I was working on my dissertation, I was a graduate student. Economists in this field were starting to recognize the value of administrative data to understand firm heterogeneity. Right? We've heard for a couple of days now all about firm heterogeneity and the importance of firm heterogeneity. And economists were starting to recognize the value of administrative data for these purposes, right? So that we can understand the population of businesses as well as entrepreneurs a little bit better. And importantly, they recognize the highly skewed nature of production, right? So just to give you a sense, less than 1% of firms account for over 50% of economic activity, certainly in the US. Of course, this is going to vary by country. But all to say that economic activity is highly skewed. And these data sets allowed us for the first time to explore the depths of this heterogeneity and to focus very much for the first time on growth dynamics as well as entrepreneurship. How were we able to do this? I was very lucky to connect early on with people like John Haltiwanger and Steve Davis. These are people that are giants in this literature. And we set out to create a longitudinal business database that covered all firms and establishments in the US economy going back to the 1970s. What this allowed us for the first time is exactly that, to track entrepreneurship, and growth dynamics. And keep in mind that I've mentioned there's economic activity is highly skewed. So it's relatively few firms get to grow to become these big companies that dominate industries today. These databases allowed us to track this process for the first time across the economy. Okay? So we were able to incorporate into our empirical analysis firm age as an important economic concept, right? So we were able to identify startups, and then we could track growth dynamics and document what those things look like. I will say key to all of this effort was a strong collaboration between statistical agencies that have access to this highly confidential data, economists that work inside these agencies, as well as academics. So the partnership between these institutions has been key, certainly in advancing research in this area. And I think that's important to recognize. And it's important also to recognize that data are being destroyed as we speak, and in the name of data protection. And data protection privacy is super, super important, right? Statistical agencies cannot function without the trust of the public and the trust of companies. So they are heavily, heavily invested in protecting this data. But statistical agencies will destroy data if they don't find the value in those data. And in the process, we lose our history and we lose our knowledge. So a plug for balance when it comes to data access, data protection, and let's not destroy our histories. Data is knowledge. We live in knowledge economies. We cannot be destroying our history. Administrative data is hard to work with, right? These are data sets that are not designed for economic research. And so they require a huge amount of work to get them to make sense, but there are huge payoffs. And so I want to tell you about some of the things that we've unveiled over many years with a large group of people. I'm going to tell you in the form of a story. All right. So I've mentioned that we were able for the first time to bring into the discussion, when it comes to empirical work, the idea of firm age, startups, and then growth dynamics. Prior to that, we had the wonderful work that Birch had done in the 80s. And we had this idea, which is very much in vogue still today, that small firms, small businesses, are the engines of growth. Right? And so this was something that was very much a part of the discussion. It's something that we still have our presidents in the US mentioned. All of them mention it with every election cycle. In the US, we have a statistical agency, I should say an advocacy agency, the Small Business Administration, that is designed to protect and advocate for small businesses. And so we had this idea that small businesses are the engines of growth. And the first thing that we did with this data is challenge this notion to some degree, and tie our empirical work a little bit closer with theory, and the theory of entrepreneurship, innovation, and growth. And so the first thing I want to do is show you this chart. And so what you see here is on the horizontal axis, you have firm size. The green chart shows you net job creation. And so you can see that small firms, on average, are engines of jobs. They create a lot of jobs. And so there is some truth to the fact that small businesses create lots of jobs. But when you peel the layers a little bit, you recognize that this job prowess of small businesses is much better attributed to startups and young firms. And so actually, when you control for the impact that young firms and startups have on job creation, you get the blue line underneath. So in fact, that relationship reverses. Okay, so it's really young firms, entrepreneurs, startups that generate and contribute to the job creation prowess of small businesses. Okay, and we can see it perhaps more clearly in this next chart. And so I want to focus your attention on small versus large firms. And in particular, here we're distinguishing now between young and mature. Okay? And so you can see here that small, mature firms look very similar in terms of their dynamics to large, established firms. So here in the blue line, you have the share of economic activity that it's accounted by small, mature businesses. Think about all of the jobs that are associated with small, mature firms. And then on the yellow bar and the red bar, you can see that you see the job creation and the job destruction patterns, the dynamics of job creation and destruction associated with these types of firms. You can see that these two patterns are very similar. Sure, there's a level difference, but in general, they look very similar, right? So something that stands out is that job destruction, the red line, is bigger than the yellow line. So on average, these firms lose jobs over time, okay? Now, pay attention to young businesses, and the patterns are completely different, right? And so, obviously, startups here, firm births, by definition, they're not going to destroy jobs, right? So you don't have a red bar. It's the first thing to notice. But note how the job creation is so. This bar is so disproportionately much larger than the blue bar. So the share. The contribution in terms of job creation relative to their size in the economy is huge for startups. Okay? Notice that continues to be true for young firms. Right? So young firms disproportionately create jobs relative to their size in the economy. But notice also that they destroy a lot of jobs. In fact, they also disproportionately destroy a lot of jobs. So keep in mind the theme of the talk, the promise and peril of entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurs create a lot of jobs, right? Young firms disproportionately create jobs. And in the first few years, they also destroy a lot of jobs, right? This very much ties to the themes that we've been talking about, right? Experimentation, failure. They're the two sides of the same coin, right? And you can see this in spades when it comes to young firm activity, okay? And so you can see this also here. So in the blue line, in the blue bars, you have net employment growth, net job creation. Here you have the horizontal axis firm age now. Okay, so we've switched purely to focus on age. And what you see is that the youngest businesses are the ones that have the tallest bars, right? They create a lot of jobs, again, relative to their size. 16% growth in the first year on average. But that's if they succeed, right? That's if they grow. That's if they don't die. The red bars show you the job destruction associated to firm shutdowns. So young firms are extremely volatile. On average, if they survive, they create a lot of jobs. But a lot of them are going to shut down, and they're going to shut down fairly quickly. And in the process, they're also going to destroy a lot of jobs. So that's what you take away from this picture, right? Those dynamics, that volatility, obviously declines over time as businesses find, whether they're good or bad, and they find their place in the world, right? It's like kids, like teenagers, right? Eventually they'll settle down, and so it's the same thing with young firms. But then we realize, right, that this was hiding a lot of heterogeneity underneath. So taking averages is not quite good enough, right? And what these data sets allowed us to do is to explore growth patterns, and growth patterns by age, and that's what you have here. So these are growth distributions. These are employment growth distributions as a function of firm age, okay? And so here in the black bar, you have firm growth for firms at the 50th percentile of the growth distribution. So this is the median. You can also think about this as the model firm. And I want you to take away from this chart is that the model firm, most young firms actually don't grow. They remain small throughout their life if they survive, right? So lots of promise, lots of potential for entrepreneurship and from entrepreneurs, but also lots of risk. Lots of them die, and most of them are not going to be creating a lot of jobs, right? They're going to create jobs for maybe one, maybe two people, maybe right, enough for a family. But really, most firms are not what we now think about growth businesses and growth entrepreneurs, right? The innovators, the innovative firms are here, right? These are firms that are innovative and that have a lot of room for growth. So sure, they enter small, but then, on average, they're going to grow and gain market share, right? That's the idea. Notice that this bar, north of the bar of the 50th percentile, is much longer than the bottoms are. So the 90/50th is much longer than the 50/10, right? It's all to say that young firms, if they are going to grow, they have a lot of room for growth, right? And again, this is where the innovative businesses are. So I want to talk a little bit more about the role of high growth in terms of job creation as well as job destruction. And it turns out that the largest share of job creation, of jobs that are being created by what we define here as high growth firms. So here we're defining high growth firms as businesses that grow in excess of 30%. Okay? And what you can see in the boxes is that 69% of all job creation in the US economy is accounted for by these high growth businesses. Okay, so going back to who creates jobs, well, it's businesses that are high growth. Obviously, if they're going to create jobs, they have to add jobs to the roles. That's the definition of high growth. And these are disproportionately young businesses. Okay, so close to 70% of all jobs are created for or are contributed to by young businesses that grow high. And of course, these businesses end up being the large companies that end up dominating industries. So these databases allow us, for the first time, to track these growth dynamics and document the importance of entrepreneurship and high-growth businesses in our economies. Okay. At the same time, of course, businesses that are in high decline, that exit, also disproportionately contribute to job destruction in our economies. Okay? So again, it's two sides of the same coin. Some firms innovate successfully and grow, and some firms are going to not innovate or perhaps become obsolete and are going to get replaced, right? And so we're going to see a lot of reallocation taking place in the economy in these databases. This is true not only of employment, also for revenue. So revenue creation, revenue growth is tightly associated with these high growth companies, these innovative firms. So of course, the next thing that we wanted to do is, okay, well, we've uncovered these patterns that line up with how we think theory should work. Now, what about the entrepreneur, right? What is the role of the entrepreneur? And this data was a little bit harder to get. We had to work quite a bit to ensure and to convince the administrative data providers that we could retain and maintain and protect the confidentiality of these records. So one of the things that we notice is that if you think about the companies that are most successful in our economy, certainly the ones that end up in the newspapers, in the press, on TV, they're often, especially these high-tech businesses, right? They're often founded by individuals that were very young. This when they created their companies, right? So think about Facebook and Google and Tesla and PayPal. All these companies were created by people that were very young when these firms were created. And we wanted to see if high growth, if innovation and radical innovation and highly successful companies was something that was tied to young age. So our businesses that are highly successful, high growth businesses, disproportionately started by young individuals. And there might be a good reason for that. Maybe young people are more transformative, they're not tied up, with existing knowledge and things that they've worked on, and so they might be more transgressive. They might be more able to create disruptive technologies, companies, and so we wanted to explore these. And so what I'm going to show you here in the blue bar is the frequency distribution of firm founders, okay? And as a function of age, okay? So on the horizontal axis, you have the age of the entrepreneur. And what you see in the blue bar, or the blue chart, is that most entrepreneurs, these are all firms in the US economy, are middle-aged, right? I'm going to say anywhere between 30 and 45, 50. So most businesses in the US are started by middle-aged folks, people like a lot of us in this room. But then the question is, okay, fine. There's lots of people that are middle-aged. Right? By the way, there's also young folks starting businesses, right? And it could be that most successful businesses are started by people here, right? And so the red bar shows you the age distribution of businesses, of entrepreneurs, that start the most successful firms, high-growth businesses. And what you see is that the most successful businesses in our economies are started by even older people. Okay, so look around. If you have a few creases like I do, you have a great chance of starting a high-growth business relative to the younger people in the room. And of course, it makes sense, right? Experience matters, and resources matter, right? We heard yesterday Schumpeter's theory of monetary theory, right? And of course it matters, right? And so this is very evident when you focus on the most successful firms in our economies. Okay, so all to say, we start with this data set, administrative data set, and we started linking a whole bunch of additional information to it, right? As we uncover facts, we can, new questions come up, and we're going to go look for data that allows us to answer those questions, right? So that was our strategy here. Okay. Around the same time, when we got finally access to this data, this is true today as well. There was a lot of discussion about the role of immigrants in our economies, right? And the conversation about immigrants typically revolves around the jobs that they take away from native workers, right? That's typically how this discussion is framed. Immigrants come into our economies and they take our jobs. They took jobs away from native workers. And we wanted to assess and balance the demand and the supply side of this, right? Because immigrants, it turns out that they also create businesses, very successful businesses. But we wanted to see if, to what degree they created jobs and how the balance stacked at the end of the day, okay? Because it could be that immigrants, yeah, sure, they create a lot of businesses, but it could be that they're micro business, they don't contribute necessarily a lot of jobs to the economy. So this is the basic question that we wanted to address. And so what I'm showing you here is the likelihood that an immigrant individual will start a business, okay? So relative to their size in the population, how many businesses do immigrants create? So that's the blue line. The gray line gives you the same probability for a native individual. So what is the likelihood that a native individual starts a business? So what you see is that the blue line, the immigrant line, is shifted to the right. Right? So what does that mean? Immigrants in the US, I'd love to do this, I'm working hard to do this type of research in Europe, but what you see is that immigrants in the US are much more entrepreneurial. They're much more likely to start businesses. They start much more businesses relative to their numbers in the population than the natives. But not only do they create more small-sized businesses, here on the horizontal axis on a log scale, you have the size of the businesses that they create. What you see is that they create more businesses of all size classes. Some of the most successful businesses in the US are started by immigrants and immigrant entrepreneurs. Okay? And so immigrants are more likely to start firms in the US, and they're more likely to start firms of all size classes. It turns out immigrant businesses tend to be more innovative, so there's more patents associated with these businesses than native firms. So when you balance the ledger in terms of the jobs that they create versus the jobs that they take, it turns out in the US, immigrants create more jobs than they take. Our back-of-the-envelope calculation suggests that a 1% increase in immigration raises the average wage by 0.24%. This is so there's lots of different questions that you can address from the data when you start bringing different pieces and looking at the population of businesses as a whole. All right. So a little bit of a plug about this book that I released last year, The Promise and Peril of Entrepreneurship. This is co-authored with Rob Furley, also Zachary Croft, and Nick Solas. And what we try to focus on in this paper is, what we try to do is to take a little bit of a step back and think about entrepreneurs from a broader perspective. We often, when we think about entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship, we think about high-growth businesses, innovative businesses, businesses that create a lot of jobs. But it turns out that most businesses, I've told you already, are small and never create a lot of jobs. All of the data sets, all of the charts that I've showed you until now are based on the population of businesses with employees. We wanted to take a step back because it turns out that 7 out of 8 businesses are businesses that never hire a single worker. And in this book, we try to bring that perspective into the conversation. What we see is that these businesses are even more volatile, right? And there's maybe, that's my interpretation of it at least, there's even more experimentation when you think about entrepreneurs from a broader perspective, including entrepreneurs that never create a job for somebody else. So in this paper, we take a step back and think about entrepreneurs also as individuals that create a job for themselves, right? And it raises lots of questions because it can also be a way to gain skills and then to move to other types of activities. Okay? About 70% of businesses that are created in the US disappear, shut down within 7 years. So huge amounts of volatility, huge amounts of experimentation. A lot of these businesses, so let me rephrase that. Very few of these businesses actually end up hiring workers. But a non-trivial share of businesses that ever hire workers have their start as a non-employer business. Okay? There's such large numbers of businesses without employees that when they transition, even though there's very few of them that transition, they account for a really large share of businesses with employees. Okay? So lots of experimentation in this segment and lots of room for thinking about the role that the experimentation that's taking place within this segment of entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship as an exploration of ideas, as a testing ground. And so those are the themes that we raise in this paper, in this book. All right. So now we have this database. We can track all businesses, all firms across the economy, across all sectors, and for a long period of time. And then the obvious question is, okay, well, what's happening over time? How are things changing? Right? And this is what we try to do with this paper. And what you see here on these 2 charts, two things. If we focus first on the chart on the right, is that startup rates are going down, and they're going dramatically down. So we didn't know this until we had access to these databases, until we created these databases. So startup rates are in deep decline over time in the US. We now know that this is also true in Europe. The other thing to note is that business dynamism, as a measure of the reallocation of workers across the economy, across firms, is also in deep decline. Now, part of this is the fact that there's fewer startups. I've shown you that young businesses are very volatile. Some of them create lots of jobs, some of them destroy a lot of jobs. And so the fact that there's now fewer young firms, that the economy is increasingly dominated by established companies, large companies, means that there's going to be less dynamism. But that only explains a portion of the decline in business dynamism. So this type of composition effects account for so much. Not a lot, it turns out. And so there's something in our economies that is slowing things down. Businesses are just not as responsive as they used to be. Okay. Notice that there's an acceleration in the decline of this measure of business dynamism after 2000. So you can see the acceleration here. And so this is work that I'm doing now. We see these patterns also in Europe. And so here on the right, on the left part of the panel, you see the same measure of business dynamism. It's just a measure of job creation and job destruction as a rate. So think about this as all of the jobs that are either created or destroyed in a given year, right? So, and you can see the trends over time. And if you focus on the trend line, right? So we abstract away from business cycles and shocks. You can see that there's a trend decline across all of Europe, pretty much. On the right side of the panel, you see a chart that shows you the share of economic activity that is accounted for by high-growth businesses. And you see that the number of people, workers, jobs associated with high-growth firms in Europe, much like in the US, is also in sharp decline. Okay? High-growth businesses, by definition almost, are the most innovative businesses in our economy, and they have a declining role as in our economies as purveyors of jobs. Okay. So there's a decline in startup activity. Some of that we know it's compositional. Some of that is not compositional. So I want to talk about the compositional side a little bit. And this paper that I'm going to talk about is not my own work. This is phenomenal work that Karahan, Paxley, and Sahin are doing. And what they tell us is that part of this compositional effect, right, the decline in startup activity, the fact that there's fewer individuals willing to start businesses in our economy, is tied to declines in the labor supply and the aging of our populations. And so the way they think about it, and it makes a lot of sense, is that if the labor supply is going down, there's fewer younger people offering their services, wages are going to go up, right? Firms are going to be competing for the people that are around. That's going to drive wages up on average for the average worker. Okay, we're going to ignore heterogeneity here. This is a macro model. It's phenomenal work that they've done. And so, and as wages go up on average, what's going to happen is that as an individual that's making a choice between being an entrepreneur or making a good living with a salaried job, are going to end up moving towards salaried job, right? So the occupational decision that an entrepreneur makes for whether to become an entrepreneur or earn a living as a salaried worker is going to, at the margin, push them to salaried work as wages go up, right? So this is what they tell us. And you can see here, right, that the startup rate in the US is very much tied to the labor supply and to declines in the labor supply in the US. Okay? They are able to account for 60% of the decline in startup activity is driven by this aging of the population. And of course, this has lots of implications, potentially, for our economies that are indeed aging, right? Okay. The margin of adjustment for this mechanism is really the startups. And I've already told you that declines in dynamism are everywhere. Firms of all sizes, firms of all ages, firms across all industries are slowing down. They're just not as responsive to their business environment. They're not as responsive to shocks, right? And so one of the questions that this raises is whether, and I've tried to give you a sense of some of the elements of the heterogeneity in this data. I've talked about businesses that are small and remain small, and businesses that are highly innovative and create a lot of jobs. And so if we think about this decline in startup activity, maybe a lot of these entrepreneurs that choose salaried work as opposed to start a business are individuals that would start what we call lifestyle businesses. Maybe these were going to be businesses that were not very productive, that didn't create a lot of jobs. So a big question that we had is whether this decline signaled a decline in high growth potential entrepreneurs or lifestyle entrepreneurs. And maybe if it's lifestyle entrepreneurs, maybe we don't worry as much, because all of the innovations that high growth entrepreneurs are going to bring into our economies are still going to be coming through. And so this is now work from Guzman and Stern, also phenomenal work, that try to get at the quantity and the quality of high growth entrepreneurs, high quality businesses. And what they do is they measure the probability that a business is going to be high growth, right? That they're going to go public, that they're going to generate patents, and they're going to tell us that the number of high growth entrepreneurs in the US is not in decline post-2000, right? That there's even perhaps more high quality entrepreneurs post-2000 than they were prior to the dot-com boom bubble, the bursting of that bubble, okay? So they're going to argue there's as many high growth entrepreneurs and high potential entrepreneurs as there used to be in post-2000. They do, however, note that prior to 2000, the actual likelihood that they would make it big, that these high growth potential entrepreneurs actually fulfilled their expectations, was higher than what was predicted by their model, right? And so you can see this here, right? There were more high success events than what is predicted by the model. Post 2000, the reverse is true. So something in the environment, they also point out, is changing the way and the success rate for these high potential ventures. Okay, so fewer of these businesses reach their goals. Now notice, back to the Schumpeterian monetary theory, that very clearly, right, these high growth potential businesses, their number is very much tied to finance, right? So this was the dot-com boom. This was the bust of the stock market, and you can see how it declined. And here you have the financial crisis. So in their model, finance and access to finance is key for high growth. Okay. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about this other aspect. So yes, there's decline in startup activity, and I've also told you that there's a decline in business dynamism. Like businesses in general, across the board, seem to be slowing down. They're just not responding. And we can measure that in the data. And that's what we try to do here. And so here we're estimating this basic policy function. So this comes out of first order conditions. So this is firm growth. And that's going to be a function of their productivity shock. The way to interpret this is very straightforward. Businesses that have a positive profitability realization, businesses that are doing well, they're going to hire hire people, right, so that they can sell more product. Businesses that are doing poorly in the market are going to be shedding workers, right, because they can't pay their operations, right? They don't have enough, they don't generate enough income. So obviously there's a relationship between the innovation, the productivity shock, and the business response to that productivity shock. But we can also estimate how that's changing over time. And what we see is that indeed businesses' response to their environment is grinding down. So here, if I can focus your attention on the chart on the right, in the dashed line, you have declines. You have the results for the US. And you can see that responsiveness, this pass-through moment from the productivity shock to employment, has declined in the US about 2.5% per year in the last 2 decades. Right? So very significant declines in responsiveness. But that's also true in Europe. And here, in the blue bars, you have the results that are significant in our estimates. And so broadly, here we have an exception with Croatia. We don't know if there's something going on with the data there. But the takeaway is that business response to their environment is also going down in Europe. And there's lots of people trying to figure out why that is, because it has obvious implications for innovation, for productivity growth, and so people think about adjustment costs, changing adjustment costs. Maybe in Europe that doesn't make as much sense. There's a lot of research in the US thinking about this as a potential driver of the slowdown. We heard yesterday about flexibility in labor markets and how there's been an effort over the years to increase flexibility in European labor markets. Intangibles can also have something to do with this. There's lots of research around the role of intangibles. And then market power and technology, right? And the role that these big, large corporations that increasingly exert power or that have increasing amounts of power might play in this regard. So lots of questions around these patterns, lots of research trying to figure out why that is. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to start wrapping up. And I want to tell you about some of the work that I'm involved in now that I'm very excited about, because I think it brings a lot of the themes of this conference and a lot of the things that we think about as a group, right? And so here we're revisiting Soviet history and German history and the German Democratic Republic history from the lens and using the apparatus that we've developed as a group over the last few decades. And so we're trying to assess what happened in the Soviet Union and in Soviet Russia and why it collapsed. Okay, and so that's the story that we're going to try to tell in this paper. This is very much work in progress. And so I want to start by motivating the paper a little bit. Okay, so here in the blue bar or the blue line, you have GDP per capita growth in the US. It goes back to the 1960s, and we have it here running through 1985. In the red line, the red curve, you have GDP growth per capita in Soviet Russia. And so you can see that after World War II, Soviet Russia was very much catching up. This is manufacturing sector in Russia. So you could see that it was catching up, but then it stalled around early 1970s. And you can see the difference between the predicted growth from the prior trend and the actual growth. And what we think is going on, what we think happened, is that, of course, market forces, experimentation, was not was completely shut down by definition, right? These were planned economies. Businesses were planned for. And there was not much experimentation in that regard. There was no competition, there was no experimentation, there was no promise, and no failure, right? The two sides of creative destruction, of innovation and growth. And you can see that in these size distribution charts. And so on the left side, you see, so you have business size in a log scale, and you have the share of firms on the vertical axis. And what you see, what we know in our economies, most businesses in our economies I've been showing you in other charts, are small businesses. Some of them are successful, some grow, a lot of them exit and decline, and many stay small, right? There's a lot of experimentation that comes from that, a lot of trial and error, a lot of testing of technologies and innovations. That's completely absent. That was completely absent in Soviet Russia. There were no small businesses. This was all planned, right? There was no experimentation. There was no competition in that regard, right? They decided who operates in the market, where, this is the size of your plant, and that's it. And again, there's no experimentation. There's no small businesses. And so we're modeling now. I'm going to focus your attention on the chart on the right. The impact that these market components would have had had they been allowed to operate, right? So we're now taking moments from market economies and simulating what would have happened in Soviet Russia had market forces worked. And so you can see that as we add elements of market economies, right, the ability of businesses to respond to their environment, right? If they have had this ability, if resources could have moved across businesses, away from less productive businesses and towards more productive businesses, which is what we expect to happen, right? For reallocation to be productivity enhancing, that would have increased their productivity by almost 10%. Were there entry and exit mechanisms and competition through entry and exit, where some businesses were allowed to fail and businesses that were productive allowed to grow, that would have generated an additional 16% of productivity growth in Soviet Russia. And then if we allowed for knowledge diffusion to happen in that economy, that would have added an additional 10% of productivity growth. So this is very early work still, but all to say that the experience of Soviet Russia post the World War II was we're gonna argue was all about capital accumulation, not a lot of experimentation, just building new factories, right? I think we're gonna call this paper where Schumpeter missed solo. So lots of physical accumulation, but there's so much that you can do with physical accumulation, right? After that, you need experimentation, you need technology, right? You need to get more productive through technological improvements. And that's what we argue failed here. There's so much that they could do with capital accumulation, and it's, we think, the reason why that economy failed. So on that note, I'll just wrap up and say that super exciting field of study. I've based my research on, over the years, on data infrastructure, and uncovering facts about the data and about our economies. This continues to be a super exciting field. Lots of questions and contributions that I've not touched upon, of course. Lots of interesting work. I think the takeaway for this audience is very obvious, right? The promise and peril of entrepreneurship, right? That is key for experimentation. That is key for growth. Competition is important, and that's what generates increasing standards of living. Okay? So accessing data continues to be difficult. We need to be able to balance access to data with privacy protections and privacy and data security, but we cannot destroy our history. These data sets tell our history. They tell the story of who we were. They tell the story of who we are. And it is important that we preserve these data sets for research, for the knowledge that they contain. And with that, I want to thank everybody for your attention. Thank you for your inspiration. And I'm so very glad that you invited me. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And we're going to have the chance to continue the conversation with two invited commentators in a panel. And I can introduce them one at a time. I will welcome them both up on stage. So next to me, my name is Anders Broström. I'm the Managing Director of the Swedish Entrepreneurship Forum, also a guest professor at University of Gothenburg. To my right, I have Susanna Fellman, who is a professor of economic history at the University of Gothenburg. Now, Susanna, Javier thinks he has had a hard time to collect useful data to study his processes. How do you, as an historian, see these challenges? And what if we want to study entrepreneurship and business dynamism beyond his time series in the 19th, 18th, or 7th centuries? Is there what can we do, and how much more work do we need to engage in?
Well, lots and lots of work. I mean, first of all, in business and economic history, more or less everything in some way deals with entrepreneurship, innovation, longevity, transformations, but we don't necessarily use these concepts. But of course, more like a business historian, and I have also worked a little bit with small firm data from a little bit earlier period than you, but not from the 16th or 17th century, but from the 1940s and 50s. I come back to that in a short while, and I try to be short now, but some more this sort of general is that this is of course directly relating to you, we should not destroy. And it's not only about destroying who we are and our history, but it's also about destroying the ability to be able to understand things in the long run. So I mean, it's also from the perspective of research, extremely important, and also for today's research. There is quite a lot of sources that can be used, but you have to be very innovative in using and finding these sources. First of all, like ordinary census data. Then we have in Sweden the business census from specific time periods. But also tax records and insurance records have been used to study entrepreneurship in history. So there are, but it's very time consuming. Nowadays, of course, things are becoming digitalized, but still very often you have to sit there yourself. And then they are terribly problematic. And that is, of course, that we always say and have to ask, what can we answer? It's very, very short period, usual, not the long time period, but it's also often very, very this sort of limited to specific industries, or especially if you look at small firms, many of the business censuses are only for over 5 employees, meaning that we don't find these ones. The small study we are doing with a colleague in Finland, and actually it's a little bit standing still at the moment for various reasons, but that was due to a project to collect information on small firms in the 40s and 50s, because it was the idea that Finland, this is on Finland, was lagging behind. And so we need to know more what is going on. and what kind of firms do we have in order to be able to promote economic growth, and especially in a divided country where they have a growing south and a staggering north. So in that way, in a way, this kind of project also creates data, and that is what we usually use.
Lots of work for us going ahead. Our second commentator is Magnus Björsnö. He's the Executive Director of the AstraZeneca BioVenture Innovation Unit and also the CEO of the AstraZeneca BioVenture Hub. So Magnus, maybe we'll ask you a few words about AstraZeneca. Why are you in Gothenburg?
I ask myself that also, actually. No, but seriously, I mean, we are totally dependent on innovation. I mean, internally and externally. And I think today we are located from a research R&D perspective in Sweden. We are in Cambridge, we are in Boston, we are outside Washington, and we are building in Shanghai. All these are very research-intense areas. And I think Gothenburg is perhaps not the most known one of these. So for us, the ecosystem around us is extremely important that it continues to be competitive. And I think Sweden, we are good in innovation. Maybe not to put it into realization, but innovation and research, I think we have a very high standard.
Right, and the ecosystem also then contains smaller firms and maybe new firms.
I mean, if you go to the pharmacy, I think 50% of products today originates from someone else than the big pharma company. If you look into our portfolio, 80% of tomorrow's products are actually sourced from smaller companies. So for us, they are super important.
Right. Yeah, we'll have a chance to come back to that also. So we've seen some very interesting data. Javier and his colleagues have done a lot of work to collect data in the last couple of decades. So if we were to, is what we're seeing here, Susanna, is this something that we can recognize from certain periods in history that has preceded us? Is this, for example, in this setting, of course, we can think about how Schumpeter thought about his Mark I and Mark II sort of conceptualizations of where growth and renewal comes from. We see here a shift from towards large firm dominance and job creation. Does this ring a bell somewhere in history, or is this a unique first time?
Yes, I mean, of course it rings a bell. And of course, those writing in the interwar period, they were, of course, writing because of the big crisis that the interwar, from one crisis to another crisis. So why do we tend to go into crisis even though we are much more developed than we were like 50 years ago or 100 years ago? So this sort of, the idea of the capitalism as some kind of volatile is of course there. But then also, perhaps less discourse that there is this sort of entrepreneurial decline. This debate, of course, also comes up, especially concerning the British economy, when the US takes over and passes, and the other ones catching up, the other Western, that there is something wrong with the British entrepreneurs, that they are too interested in, you know, luxury life and are not entrepreneurial anymore. So there are these debates quite early also. And we find, if you look down to entrepreneur magazines, you find these debates on that people are more interested in going into the big firms when they are educated from the business schools or from the engineering schools, that they are not becoming entrepreneurs, but they are becoming. But I think that still, today's debate is perhaps, it has been going on for very long, and also during the good years. So I think that I'm so old that I also follow what the debate, not only as a researcher, but also somebody following societal debates, is that there is some kind of idea that we are always somehow slowing down. And then afterwards, we can see that, yes, sometimes we are really slowing down, but that sometimes we are not actually doing it. But I think that because of that, and that is one of the things that I really, really think this is so important, to go back to basics, to get new and important data that is really usable for all kinds of research questions, in order also to see what is happening in the long run, really, and not only what is the dominant narrative of the period that we are now slowing down.
So many questions to...
I think it's very obvious that what we see, but I think the interesting question is why? So what is, I mean, if you study history, if you look back, what is the link between what you see and why you see it? I think that is what needs to be discussed. And I mean, you stated that there is a decline in numbers of startups, and you claim there is a decline in quality. Is it a decline in quality, or is it rather a reflection of the willingness to take risk among investors? Because you link it to capital, and we see a very big difference in where they choose to invest. I don't think entrepreneurs take less risk today, rather the opposite.
Yeah. So just a couple of reactions to this conversation, which is great. So maybe I'll start with your thoughts, and then I'll come back to finance. And the question about historical patterns, right? And so, Maureen, I think yesterday you mentioned Steve Clipper, right? And industry dynamics and growth dynamics and how mature technologies are. And as you all know, there's huge conversation between techno-optimists and techno-pessimists out there. And some folks suggest that we are riding the end of the latest, of the ACT technological revolution, right? So Steve Gordon is a proponent very much of this theory, right? We've exploited the low-hanging fruit with the ICT technologies, and that's reflected in the productivity growth, the decline in dynamism that we observe. The techno-optimists say, well, but hold on, because there's AI, and we saw a lot of papers over the last couple of days on AI. And so techno-optimists say, well, there's a new revolution coming up. There's always a new technological revolution coming up, and maybe that will spur growth. So there's this question of, technologies, technological cycles, and how much of this is kind of the end of a technological cycle and the beginning of a new one. Unfortunately, we're not seeing the productivity impacts of the new technological revolution yet. But the techno-optimists will say, well, it's always taken a few years, maybe a decade or two, to convert these technologies into general-purpose technologies that can broadly be applied by businesses to generate and increase their productivity. So that might be something of what we're seeing. I'm struck by something that you said on young individuals and where they choose to work. And this is something that I'm very interested in exploring. Because it is still true that the US, for example, is much more entrepreneurial than many European countries. And something that I'm very interested in exploring is what are young STEM innovators, inventors choosing to go work for? Do they crave and want the security of working for an established, highly innovative company, perhaps, but that is by definition almost going to be working on incremental innovations, right? They're good at what they do, and that's their sphere, right? That's their technological sphere. Or do they choose to go for a young, dynamic company that can fail, right? So the entrepreneurial spirit of workers matters for where they're gonna go, right? Who they're gonna choose to be employed with, and that's gonna also have an impact on the technologies that are being developed in our economies, right? If you go to work for BMW, then you're gonna be working on improving the car a little bit, right? If you go work for nascent Tesla, you're gonna be working on a radical new car that it drives itself, and maybe it works, maybe it doesn't work, but the point is that where you choose to work as an innovator, as a young STEM worker, is going to determine the technologies that are being developed by these companies. And then finally, sorry, I'm going, I love this thing. And then finance is key, right? And the chart that I show you about from Guzman and Stern, they clearly pushed back on some of the work that I was doing, and they were making the same point that you were making. It's like, I'm sorry, I don't know what you're talking about, because I see Silicon Valley thriving, right? There's more entrepreneurs every day, And so they were pushing back on that. And there's lots of money, right? But money comes in cycles as well. That's fine. But part of the response is, sure, there's lots of startup activity in certain sectors. It seems like it's a lot easier to start businesses now. Maybe there's a lot more financing, but it's not translating yet into productivity in our economies.
I'm really curious about your work, because I think there is a big difference between different industry verticals here. I mean, if you look on, for example, we see today that most of the innovation in the space of, for example, AI, it's made by the larger firms, because you need huge infrastructure, you need huge investments, and it's a huge barrier for the small firms to enter that space. But once it is established, will we see a shift? What's your view on the difference between...
This is a really, really good question. I think so. I know lots of people are very much focused on understanding and addressing this question. And so, because you're absolutely right? It's not like these firms, these large companies don't innovate. They do innovate, and some of these companies are extremely good at what they do. I mean, they're superstars. They're superstar firms. They're really good at what they do. They're really good at innovating. And the question right now, is whether that, the fact that they're so far ahead of the competition is stifling innovation.
And do they take their responsibility, you think?
And so I think there's case studies, right? We can think about Google, and so they've certainly. So I could let me answer this way. There's lots of people trying to do systematic analysis of what these companies are doing, because we can pick and choose, right, from what we see in the media, and we can tell whatever story that we like. And so I think there's lots of people focused on doing systematic analysis. I think you're absolutely right. Different sectors have different stories, right? And so there's lots to investigate, but there's lots of concern that companies like Google, for example, are so powerful, so ahead of the competition, that it's stifling, because entrepreneurs don't want to, right? And VC is not going to invent, right? They're not necessarily going to invest in companies that are going to fail once Google sets them in their sights. There's lots of different stories that you could tell. I'm not telling any particular one. I'm just simply saying that there's lots of concern and lots of interest in trying to understand this, and we don't have the answer. We don't have the answers yet. If indeed there's less competition because entrepreneurs are not willing to take on Google, that's also going to mean that Google is not going to have as much of an incentive, right, to do better, right? Because you don't have the young upstart trying, right behind you, trying to kill you.
Speaking of small firm, large firm dynamics, then Magnus, how is AstraZeneca relating to new businesses in your work? And in your work in particular,
I think in any big business, there is always this fight between exploration and exploitation. The larger the firm, the better are in exploiting their resources. In order to continue to grow and innovate, we need to explore more. And I think what we have realized, especially in our business, where the product of the future will not be medicines in isolation, we need to work across different industry verticals. So the definition of innovation is totally different compared to 10 years ago. And we don't have all the competence. So we actually, as you may know, we have built an environment where we actually invite small companies that could contribute to innovation in a different way than we do. And we try to support them, because we are a tiny percentage of all the innovative power on the globe. And if we think that we can solve the problems ourselves, we will definitely be gone in 10 years' time. So I think we do what we can to support and promote them. And I think big companies has a huge responsibility, because without the smaller innovative firms, we won't exist. And you take it for granted that they exist and they grow. But I think the data is different. So I think this is a very important discussion.
So we can blame you and thank you for your small firm interactions.
You are the moderator. You can do whatever you want.
Right. I also want to push the, I mean, there are still so many questions that this sort of trend data also gives rise to about also the consequences and interpretations that I think we should also have some time to take up here. I mean, digitalization and globalization may weaken the incentives to entry and make rapid firm growth less a common phenomenon in our economies. But they also, of course, create great economic and social value. So are these trends necessarily problematic? And what indications do we have for that? Is creative destruction maybe less relevant for innovation and productivity growth today? Or should we be worried? Do we still need Schumpeter around?
I can start. But I'll start by noting that this is a really good question, and a question that centers a lot of researchers' attention. I will note that with these trends, we're also observing declines in productivity growth. And ultimately, that's what matters for standards of living and growth. And without productivity growth, wages don't go up. And productivity growth has been the engine of increased standards of living. And so that's why we're worried about these trends, about what they mean, and certainly we seem to be losing productivity.
Yes, I think that sometimes we forget this, that productivity is what we are aiming for, because that is what people want. But then, of course, and global periods have been periods of openness, economic growth. Where is the egg and the hen is always a little bit also a discussion that when you have a good economic development, technological development, then you in a way want to spread and there is not the dangers. Then you become protectionistic when there is a threat to and you put up protective barriers to in a way to protect your industries or your infant industry and so on. So in that way, but they go hand in hand. But of course there is also today trade-offs that are problematic, as have been discussed here also, what to do with the geopolitical problems and so on, and what should we take home and protect in a way, and where should we be open, because we all know that the openness is the economic rationale is very strong, but then there are other problems at the same time. But in order for this, I mean, innovative capacity is key also for the productivity. So in that way, there is no.
I mean, I'll say something that people are also have documented now in the literature is that large companies. I'm not gonna. It's not sector specific on average. So ignoring all the heterogeneity that exists, right? On average, large firms increasingly focus on incremental innovations. So there is a role for government, right? Also in pushing where we invest and where we do R&D. And increasingly, certainly in the US, large companies, which in the past used to be much more focused on fundamental R&D, are increasingly doing incremental innovation. And that has implications for productivity and the types of technologies that are being developed. And so there is certainly a role for government, and I think the US recognizes this in spades. There's lots of programs in the US talking about finance that fund highly risky ventures, right, that are more focused on fundamental innovations, that have a longer payoff, right? So I think there's a lot of room for more fundamental R&D And certainly, companies increasingly now are shying away from that. And there's reasons for that. Appropriability being one of them, right? You can't appropriate the use of the results from your innovations. Well, that's a good reason to not invest on those things, right? And focus on the things that you're good at. So it's a challenge, I think, for large companies, to try to push into new areas, do more fundamental R&D, as opposed to do the type of innovation that is incremental, just tweaking the type of products that they've been working with and that they're good at, right?
And I think it partly goes back to management. If you look into any large firm, the people who know, and this is a personal statement, so it has nothing to do with AstraZeneca, I promise you. But the people who get promoted are those who are good in optimizing the output of processes and systems. But what we talk about here is about orchestrating creativity. And those two are basically in conflict with each other. So I think you're fully right. But I think one important comment when you talk about decline, I don't think there is a decline on a global level. Because if we look into China now versus 5 years back, innovation is exploding. But in Europe, it is declining. So I think I'm worried about this discussion in the context of Europe. I think US is still okay, but Europe, I mean, the barriers for entrepreneurship today with regulatory aspect, finance, GDPR, I can make this list so long, and we say we are surprised. I don't think we should be.
I think you raise a good point. We've not talked about the regulatory environment, right, and the framework conditions, and those matter. And I'm completely with you.
Incentives for entrepreneurs. I mean, it's many dimensions in these discussions, and 45 minutes won't solve the problem, I tell you.
I agree. I agree.
Well, what can solve the problem is, of course, a very clever floor to raise. So I suggest we pick up like 3 questions from the floor. Victor, if we start in the front here with Bo.
Thank you for a very...
Please, Bo, since we have also a streaming audience, I will ask you to wait for a microphone from Lina here before you raise the question.
Thank you for a very interesting and stimulating paper. I'd like to ask you about the lack of dynamism or declining dynamism. It seems that you're talking about that in terms of job growth. What about if you measure dynamism not in terms of job creation, but in terms of other activities, sales, value-added, innovation? So how do you measure success? And related to that, I think we are seeing a shift in the nature and locus of innovation. Take the biotech industry, for example, which is probably the most science-based industry that we have, where scientific discoveries take time, and then they have to be converted into intellectual property, and before they, and then you have approvals and so forth. But before that, you may have not a firm created, but the intellectual property being purchased by a big pharma firm, for example. And I think you can see that happening in the semiconductor industry, but not to the same extent. And so I think there's a shift in the division of labor, so to speak, so that the big firms, instead of having to take the risk and invest the capital in making the discovery, they can scan the horizon and pick up the ideas and build their business. I don't know how that shows up in your statistics. That's something you might be able to clarify. But in addition to that, the results of that may take a long time. You mentioned Bob Solow and his famous comment about, we see computers everywhere except in the productivity statistics. I think these kinds of discoveries that we're talking about, particularly in the biotech industry, take a long time to come to fruition. And so it may be a long time before we see the productivity growth.
Thank you. I think we should collect one more quick question before we, maybe at the back there.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes, you can. So thanks a lot, Javier, for the presentation. It was very interesting. And I think my question goes a little bit in line with what was asked about the division of labor, but it also relates with the word which is verticals that was mentioned before. Because indeed, what we see with AI, but what we see also with many other high-tech sector, I know that you're not only looking at high-tech, is the, let's say, the complexification of products, or the return of what were called system products. And when you have system products, then you might have that the value capture is not at the level of the application, it's not at the level of the, let's say, final consumer market. So the entry of new firms might be hindered by the fact that value generation, value capture is somehow somewhere upstream. So maybe I missed it from the presentation, but if you somehow looked also not only in general at the overall stylized fact, but also how the structure of the, let's say, vertical nature of industries might affect the declining or not declining dynamism. And then just a comment that, not related to Javier's presentation, but to what has been said about China and Europe. It's always easy to say that Europe is overregulated, but it's not that China is underregulated. I mean, the point is that their capital accumulation maybe is easy, maybe in Europe is less easy and we have fragmented policies, but it's always a little bit an excuse to say that overregulation stifles innovation. What we see is that we have overall dynamics going on, so maybe we should be a bit more scientific on that, but that was not on the talk of Javier, it was on the comments from the guests. Thanks.
Thank you, and comments and response from all three of you then to round up the session, please.
So I'll be very quick. So on the sales, very good question. We've done this on sales, and so we see the declines in responsiveness also on the investment side and on the sales side. So so it's affecting not only employment but also revenue. It is true. I promised I was going to be quick, but there's always lots to say. It is true that businesses increasingly in a globalized world, right, can go hire workers in other countries. They can outsource, but this is a minimal impact. Has a minimal effect on the things that we're talking about. So on sales, we see the same effects. The M&A question is really, really important. It's something that Magnus also talked about. It's related to the vertical integration question. So there's lots of research now trying to figure out how the M&A landscape, right, how M&A is changing the nature of how innovation is brought about. A part of what I'm very, very interested in exploring is, and I'm convinced of this, right, there are large firms that are very smart and that have figured out that they need to, right, keep innovating and maybe need to partner and explore innovations with younger companies. And there is this question as to whether that's what's happening, or and I think we're going to see both things in the data, or they're also killing competition, right? They have the ability to squish the competition, and we've seen some of this in venture capital, right? Venture capital is not going to go into products and areas that are easily killed by the existing large companies. And I think I'm going to stop there
No, and I mean, the comment on Europe, I think it's not an isolated, whether it's regulatory. I think if you look on the totality of why should I take the risk, it looks different in different parts of the world. And I think there is a difference between research and development and marketing. So if you regulate research and regulate development, it impacts the willingness to invest, and it's a multifaceted equation. But I think what we see among small firms is that they increasingly move across the sea because it's easier for them. And then you can debate why. It's just a fact. And it worries me.
Are you worried?
Yes, I'm worried. And in a little bit, in a way, it's the same as you in that way, that in a way the debate has gone also very much into the regulation side, and we regulate before we innovate in a way. So we need institutions, we need good institutions, and this is one of the things also that economic history has learned, taught us, that they are the ones that create the incentives and so on, or stop them. So in that way, I think. But also then we have the demography, age problems, and so on. So which education, another thing that R&D, which are very important to focus on. But it's not easy again to decide for the future. It's easier to be a historian and say that they did that very well or not so well, like in the Soviet or so.
Excellent. A few worries left to investigate, and also thank you very much, all the three of you, for this lecture. We have a few small gifts of appreciation for you. Please.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Tack så mycket.